Autumn, 1851. The fog that morning clung low to the slopes of the Appalachians, damp as a shroud, swallowing whole the outlines of the old copper mine 3 miles east of Millbrook. The first frost still glittered on the brittle grass when Sheriff Jacob Miller arrived with a detachment of 8 armed men. Their boots sank into the soft earth, and the air reeked of wet leaves and the ghost of rusting metal from the abandoned workings. At the mine's mouth stood a wall of stone and timber, the crude barricade thrown up years before when the last owners swore the shaft had gone barren. Miller gave the order. Picks rang, splinters flew, and soon the opening yawned wide enough for the black breath of the earth to exhale. It came as a smell first, not the simple staleness of enclosed air, but something older, thicker, the unmistakable stench of decay. The men worked by lamplight, the yellow glow revealing the pale curve of bone just inside the rubble. At first they thought it a solitary skeleton, a miner perhaps, lost in some forgotten collapse. Then another form emerged. Then another. And still more. By nightfall, the tally stood at 43 sets of remains, each stripped of clothing, each without a coffin or marker. The mountain had been a grave for decades, a grave no one was meant to find. Miller stood at the lip of that pit as the last bodies were brought out. He knew then that these were not the anonymous dead of some distant accident. These were travelers, men and women who had vanished along the road, their fates swallowed in silence. He also knew that this was not the work of chance. There was a pattern here. A design. And somewhere behind it stood faces he recognized. In his mind, one image would not leave him, for women, the McAllister sisters, standing in the warm lamplight of the Millbrook Inn, smiling, gracious, and deadly. Spring came late to Millbrook in 1851, a pale thaw that left ruts in the turnpike and a gray skin of ice in the cattle troughs. The forge hammered again, the church doors stood open on Sundays, and peddlers resumed their slow pilgrimage along the mountain road with saddlebags of needles, ribbons, and patent tonics. On the surface, the town returned to its ordinary rhythms. Yet Miller felt a grit in the gears, a thin discord that would not resolve. It began with letters. A tinsmith's wife in North Carolina, neat hand beseeching, had anyone seen Mr. Edwin Pike, traveling with 2 trunks and a roll of sheet copper? A cousin from Lynchburg asking after a watch repairer, one Isaiah Dent, who carried a velvet case of customer pieces and never returned them. Miller answered each note as duty required. No, we have no record. Yes, we will inquire. But the pile grew on his desk, tied with twine like a bundle of reeds. Names faded into the paper as if the mountain mist had soaked through the ink. The tavern whispers coalesced around a single waypoint. Men remembered the friendly lamplight of the Millbrook Inn, the smell of boiled coffee at dawn, the quiet way the youngest McAllister, Clarissa, set a plate on a table without clatter. More than one traveler had praised the establishment in the last letter he ever sent. Found decent lodging at the McAllister's house, wrote one. Clean beds, fair rates. Will push on north after taking my rest. Nothing followed. Among these was Samuel Parks, cotton factor of Augusta, 39 years old, a man with a gelding that stamped and frothed in every town yard. He was due in Wheeling to meet Northern partners by April 14th, and never arrived. In the post office ledger, the last place his route could be fixed was Millbrook. The postmaster, Mr. Lyle, remembered the horse more than the rider. Good hooves, he told Miller. A well-shod beast. I'd have wagered the road on him. Parks's saddlebags, by estimation, held drafts and cash enough to buy a small farm. The McAllister sisters' reputation, on paper, was unsullied. Emma, the eldest, kept accounts with a precise, almost schoolmistress hand. Her chin had a determined point, and she spoke to suppliers as if they were junior clerks. Lillian floated where Emma set her anchors. Men recalled her laugh the way they recalled summer fruit, sweet, slightly intoxicating. Mary's province was the stillroom behind the kitchen, where jars glowed like captive suns, syrups, cordials, remedies. She tended a square of earth where foxglove sent up purple bells and belladonna made glossy black beads. Clarissa, 15 when the talk began, moved like a chapel bird, solemn and quick, gathering plates, reading faces, leaving no ripple in her wake. Miller did not trust reputations. He rode out of town on small errands that led him past the inn at unremarkable hours. In the morning he saw Lillian at the upstairs window, hair unbound, watering geraniums. At dusk he saw a teamster unload a crate of lemons and a hogshead of molasses, the sort of purchases a careful innkeeper makes to stretch flavor through lean months. Once, near midnight, he saw no lamp at all, and yet, standing in the hedgerow, breathing the cool, he heard the dull, contained thump of something heavy set down on packed earth, then dragged. A door kissed its latch. Silence returned like a held breath released. Rumor, meanwhile, moved with the speed of hunger. The blacksmith swore he had shod Parks's gelding 2 days before the man vanished. A farm boy claimed he had seen a riderless horse grazing along the creek with the saddle still cinched askew. A widow said she had sold laudanum to Mary for women's complaints, and felt wicked later because the bottle was larger than custom. None of it met the standard of proof. All of it made a shape if one stood back and squinted. Quietly, Miller began to test the town's memory. He borrowed church records. He asked the stage driver to mark dates against the inn's busiest nights. Then he visited graves. At the far corner of the churchyard, where burials sloped toward the woodlet, fresh dirt had settled on 2 plots without stones. Potters, said the S***ston, shrugging. A peddler took fever. The other. Some drifter. When pressed, the man could not name who had authorized the burials. I was told to show Christian charity, he said, eyes sliding to the side. In April, a ragged man limped into the general store, his coat smeared with clay as if he had crawled for miles. He called himself Miner John, and claimed to have been prospecting the old copper seams. The storekeeper gave him coffee and a heel of bread. In exchange the man muttered a warning. There's a stink up past the inn, he said, where the mountain swallows sound. You can hear a hammer no one is swinging. Miller arrived within the hour, but Miner John was gone, a copper coin left on the counter as if to make his tale official. The sheriff's first formal visit to the inn took place on May 3rd, just before sundown. He wore no star. He asked for no room, only a cup of coffee and a place by the fire to warm the road from his joints. Emma received him with polite reserve. Lillian appeared as if conjured by his need, setting the cup at his elbow, smiling with that careful warmth that made a man feel singled out by fortune. Mary, when he asked about the garden, spoke readily of weather and blight, naming plants by Latin and country names both. Clarissa kept to the periphery and watched. Trade good? Miller asked. As God permits, Emma answered. The road is thin this year. And strangers? We run a house for travelers, Sheriff, Lillian said, as if the words were a blessing. They come, they go. Some arrive heavy and leave light. Miller said casually, blowing on his coffee. Mary laughed, a small, practiced sound. Is that not the way of travelers? Money burns. He let the conversation trail. He asked to see the register as any cautious man might, seeking his own name for comfort. Emma produced it at once. The pages showed a steady hand, a string of names that meant nothing until they meant too much: Pike, Dent, S. Parks scrawled in a bolder ink, 2 initials only, a blank line where the pen had blotted and been wiped away. Rates paid. Days stayed. Nothing outwardly amiss, and yet the entries ran like a stream with stones beneath it. When he rose to leave, Clarissa held the door. For a moment her eyes lifted to his, and in them he saw not innocence but discipline, an attention that weighed him like a parcel. He tipped his hat and stepped into the cooling air. The road home felt longer than it had that morning. That night he began a second ledger, kept beneath the false bottom of his desk drawer. In it he wrote the dates of arrivals and the dates of last sightings. He drew a tiny cross where a letter seeking a man had found only silence. He noted that Lillian wore a bracelet of small silver bells that jingled just enough to announce her approach and never enough to betray her when it mattered. He noted that Mary's hands were stained not only with benign herbs but with the green of foxglove, which leaves a bitterness under the nails that soap does not entirely lift. By June, the town had split along a seam that was older than the rumor itself. Those who profited by the road, The teamsters, the grocers, the innkeepers, urged patience, decency, the presumption of innocence. Those who lived by the hillside, woodcutters, field hands, widows who counted eggs, grew watchful and hard. Something eats men here, an old lumberman told Miller on his porch, looking at the ridge line as if the trees might shift and show their teeth. Maybe it's hunger. Maybe it wears a dress. What unsettled Miller most was not the stories, but the politeness with which the town avoided them. Doors that had always stood open now closed softly as he passed. At the pump, women who had once traded recipes lowered their voices when the inn was mentioned, as if the mere air might carry words to the wrong ears. In the distance, from the direction of the mountain, came the occasional thud of work performed in secrecy, too regular to be wind, too distant to be innocent. The pattern resolved itself in his mind with the inevitability of weather. Men arrived alone, with ready money and no close kin. They found welcome and ease at the McAllisters. They vanished into fog and silence. If he moved too soon, the town would turn on him. If he moved too late, the mountain would keep feeding. He closed the ledger, laid his palm on its cover, and felt the steady thrum of his own pulse, as if the book had learned a heartbeat. Sheriff Miller's nights had grown restless. Every time the wind rattled the shutters, he thought of the mine, sealed for decades, hiding the dead in its cold belly. 6 months of quiet watching had yielded only fragments, whispers, half-glimpses, and one frightened man now lying cold in his barn. The McAllister sisters continued their work at the Millbrook Inn, greeting guests with the same practiced warmth. Travelers arrived at dusk, lured by the glow of lamps in the windows and the promise of stew by the hearth. They were strangers, faces that would fade quickly from the townsfolk's memory. Sometimes Miller saw them ride in and never ride out. Late one evening, Miller sat at his desk with the guest registry spread before him. A thin film of dust covered its leather cover. The sisters rarely offered it for inspection. Page after page told the same quiet story: solitary guests, 1 or 2 nights' stay, no forwarding address. He noted names, towns, occupations. A dry goods agent from Baltimore. A lawyer from St. Louis. A fur trader from Quebec. Always men traveling alone, often in possession of goods worth more than their horse. 2 names were crossed out in faint pencil, a habit Emma claimed was for those who left without paying. Miller knew better. Both men had been reported missing within weeks of their stay. The more he studied the ledger, the clearer the pattern became. He began keeping a private list, locking it in his desk drawer. If anything happened to him, it would be enough to force the judge's hand. One stormy afternoon, a clue came by way of the old lumberman Silas Dray. Miller found him nursing a whiskey at the tavern, his beard slick with rain. Dray spoke of the mountain paths he had worked in his youth and the black holes miners avoided even in daylight. One of them, he said, lay less than a mile from the inn, a narrow mouth in the rock, masked by bramble and shadow. Not even wolves sleep there, he muttered, eyes fixed on the glass. Things go in and don't come out. That night Miller rode out alone. The wind carried the damp smell of leaves and earth, and the moon was hidden. He left his horse tethered at the road and pushed through the underbrush with a lantern. After 20 minutes the brambles gave way to a cleft in the hillside. Cold air seeped out like breath. Inside, the blackness was absolute. He didn't dare enter. Instead, he marked the spot in his mind and returned to town, the damp still clinging to his clothes by the time he reached his desk. Meanwhile, the sisters began to change. Lillian no longer lingered with guests in the parlor, preferring instead to watch from the staircase. Mary was seen more often in the herb garden, her baskets heavy with plants Miller recognized from his grandmother's remedies, and some from her warnings. Clarissa, once eager to speak to townsfolk, now kept her head lowered when passing on the street. Emma's gaze, cool and assessing, seemed to follow Miller wherever he stood. Word came that Samuel Park's partners had arrived from Georgia, pressing Miller for news. Their voices were tight with worry, but when he hinted at the inn, their faces stiffened. "You think women did this?" one of them asked, almost laughing. Yet neither could name the last man who'd seen Parks alive. Miller began keeping 2 deputies close, men he trusted not to speak out of turn. Together, they walked the edges of the property at night, noting lanterns burning in upper windows long after guests retired, and the occasional faint glow deep in the woods where no path lay. One midnight, crouched in the shadow of a split-rail fence, Miller saw movement along the tree-line. Two figures, Mary and Emma, hauling a burden between them. It was wrapped in canvas, sagging in the middle, and they moved with effort toward the brambled hillside. He followed at a distance until they reached the dark mouth Silas had spoken of. Without a word, they disappeared inside. When they emerged, their hands were empty. The next day, the inn's hearth burned hotter than usual, the air thick with the smell of stewing meat and spices. Guests praised the meal. Miller ate nothing. By early October, Miller knew the time for quiet watching had ended. He feared Parks was already lost, yet there was a chance, slim, but worth taking, that another victim still lived. The mine was too dangerous to enter without numbers. The sisters were too practiced to catch alone. He began to plan in earnest, mapping the inn, noting which rooms held locked chests, which doors creaked. He met his deputies in the blacksmith's loft after dark, laying out the timing, the routes, the order of search. 8 men would surround the inn at dawn. The woods would be watched. No one would leave unseen. Still, a part of him knew, if the sisters guessed his move before the sun rose, they would vanish into the fog like so many of their victims. The night before the raid, Millbrook lay under a cold mist, the kind that swallows sound and bends lantern light into halos. Sheriff Miller sat alone at his desk, the oil lamp burning low, his coat still on. The map of the inn lay before him, edges curled from repeated handling. He had drawn each room from memory, the placement of the hearth, the windows in the guest chambers, the narrow stair to the cellar. On another scrap of paper, he listed the men he would trust with his life at dawn. They would move at first light. 8 in all, 2 to guard the front, 2 to cover the back and garden, 4 to search. Miller's instructions were clear: no G** fire unless met with force, no hesitation if the sisters tried to flee. Every door, every chest, every cellar trap would be opened. He left the office just before midnight. The town was still, save for the creak of a sign above the tavern and the far-off bark of a dog. Passing the darkened windows of the general store, he caught his reflection, hat low, jaw set, eyes older than he remembered. He thought of the 43 graves yet unopened, the missing men whose names he'd written in his secret ledger, and he felt the cold settle deeper into his bones. By dawn, fog lay thick along the main road. The men gathered silently behind the blacksmith's shop, rifles cradled, breath steaming in the chill. Miller gave a final nod. They split into 2 groups, moving like shadows down the rutted lane toward the inn. The Millbrook Inn looked almost innocent in that gray morning light. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a faint glow showed in one of the upstairs windows. The porch boards creaked under Miller's boots as he mounted the steps, flanked by Deputy Harris. Behind him, the other men fanned out to their positions. Emma McAllister herself opened the door. She wore a dark dress with a neat white collar, her hair pinned high. Her face betrayed nothing. "Sheriff," she said calmly, as though expecting a routine visit. "Morning, Emma," Miller replied. "We'll be looking through the premises today. I trust you'll oblige." Her eyes flicked past him to the men at the garden fence, the 2 at the back door. A pause, no more than a breath, then she stepped aside. "You'll find we have nothing to hide." Inside, the air was warm and carried the smell of bread baking. Lillian stood at the parlor doorway, a shawl draped over her shoulders. She smiled faintly, though her eyes followed every movement of the deputies. Mary was nowhere in sight. Clarissa sat at the bottom of the stairs, hands folded in her lap, gaze fixed on the floor. The search began upstairs. Harris and 2 men worked methodically through the guest rooms, opening trunks, checking under beds, prying up loose floorboards. They found clothing of various sizes, mismatched shoes, and a half-filled satchel containing letters addressed to names Miller recognized from his ledger. In the parlor, Miller lifted the lid of a cedar chest and found men's coats, well-made, city tailoring, none marked with the inn's name. A locked cupboard behind the bar yielded silver pocket watches, gold rings, and a stack of folded banknotes bound with ribbon. Mary appeared from the kitchen then, carrying a tray of tea as if the search were no more than a social call. Miller stopped her with a hand to the tray. "Where's your garden key?" he asked. "In my apron," she replied, her voice even. The deputies followed him to the back. The garden's neat rows stood heavy with late blooms, but among the cabbages and root vegetables grew belladonna, foxglove, and hemlock, their colors vivid in the pale light. Miller bent to inspect the soil. It was freshly turned in 2 patches near the fence, though no seeds had been planted. In the cellar they found more. Shelves lined with jars of preserved fruits and vegetables, and on the far wall, several heavy crates nailed shut. Harris pried one open with his knife. Inside lay neatly folded clothes, each set wrapped in paper. Beneath them, a leather-bound ledger. Miller flipped through its pages. Names, dates, amounts. Notes like, "Arrived with gold watch," and "Disposed at mine." Each entry matched a name in his own secret list. By the time they reached the hidden path into the woods, the fog had begun to lift. The deputies moved quickly, following the trail Miller had marked weeks before. At the bramble-hidden mouth of the old mine, the air was colder still. Lanterns lit the narrow passage, and soon the beam fell on what no man present would forget: the remains, stacked in haphazard order, some half covered in rotting canvas, others lying bare. 43 by nightfall. Among them, Samuel Parks. His boots still bore the Georgia maker's stamp. They worked in silence, carrying each set of remains to the wagons. Above ground, the sisters were kept under guard, their calm never breaking. When Miller finally returned to the inn to confront them, Emma only said, "You'll find the mountain keeps what it's given, Sheriff. You've just taken it back." Autumn tightened its grip on Millbrook with a damp, insinuating chill. The road darkened early, and fog came down from the ridges like unspooled wool, snagging on fences, swallowing fences whole. Sheriff Miller felt the season as a hand at his throat. If the sisters sensed his net, they would draw back into the mountain and the town would pretend, again, not to see. They had changed their habits. The inn no longer glittered with laughter past midnight. Lillian's music box, once wound each evening so that a tinny waltz spun through the parlor, fell quiet. Emma kept the ledgers out of sight. Mary began boiling her vials to a thicker syrup, sealing them with rosin and twine. Clarissa moved from room to room with a ring of keys that hadn't been visible before. There were new locks. There were new silences. 2 merchants due from Abingdon delayed their travel after a warning letter reached them bearing the sheriff's hand, only it was not his hand. Someone had forged his name to scatter suspicion, to turn strangers aside and thin the flow of prey. When Miller learned of it, he tasted the bitterness of being anticipated. The sisters were not merely careful. They were counseled by someone who understood official routine, or had studied it as one studies a catechism. He pushed harder. Quietly, he spoke to Reverend Talley and to the smith, to the old lumberman who remembered shafts that opened like mouths, to Mrs. Peck, who rented out 2 back rooms and had once refused Lillian's request to board a cousin for the night. He took statements without quills, memorized them, and burned their scraps in his stove. The judge in Nashville would later ask where the paper trail lay. "In my head," Miller would answer, "and in the ground." A rumor reached him that a peddler had been turned away from the inn at dusk with the explanation that all rooms were taken. The man slept in his wagon under an oak and was gone by dawn. No breakfast, no coffee, no Clarissa at the door with a cup against the morning chill. Odd. The inn never left money on the road. Unless there was something inside that could not endure a stranger's eyes. Deputy Harris returned from a ride along the creek with a scrap of canvas he had found snagged in root and stone. It bore a brownish stain that rain had only thinned. The weave matched sacks used for flour or meal, but the cord threaded through the hem was finer than a farmer would waste on grain. In the same tangle of roots he found a brass button engraved with a city maker. Miller put both in his pocket, and felt their weight the rest of the day. Another thread, the S** Stan admitted, after a long pause and a longer prayer, that he had been paid in silver to dig 2 night graves. For charity. The coin had come wrapped in clean paper. It smelled faintly of bitter herbs. Speed, then. He could not wait for a lettered commission or call a jury to the hedgerow. The fog would serve the sisters as well as it served him. Each night it rolled down like a curtain, hiding the scene changes. If he moved before he could nail every board of the case, the town might mutiny. If he moved after, there would be no case to nail. He began to drill his men after dark, not with rifles but with doors. At the blacksmith's loft they practiced crossing thresholds, peeling left and right with lanterns held high, calling the warnings they would have to mean. They learned the sound of a false bottom tapped with a knuckle. They learned to search beds without ruining sheets, to upend trunks without scattering their contents to a draught. The work of justice, Miller knew, required tidiness as much as courage. A sloppy search breeds mercy for the guilty. He also prepared for failure. In a tobacco tin he sealed a list of names and dates and tucked it beneath the floorboard under his desk, where the knot opened like a mouth. He sent a brief note to the magistrate 2 counties over. Expect prisoners and remains. Send a coroner. Send a clerk with a steady hand. He did not sign it. He did not trust the post. By early October the town's patience frayed. Teamsters complained of being stopped along the ridge by a figure who spoke in a woman's voice and asked where they were bound. The church ladies, gathering boiled linens for the poor, found their bundles counted and recounted by Clarissa as if charity itself were a ledger to be balanced. The forge took orders for 2 iron locks larger than any door in Millbrook required. For my smokehouse, Emma said smoothly, and no one laughed. On the 10th, Miller sent Harris south to borrow men he could vouch for, men with no cousin tied to the McAllisters by favors or flour. They returned 2 nights later, a former constable with a scarred cheek, a farmer whose boy had vanished on a peddler's errand, a wiry Welsh miner who hated holes in the earth. 8 in total, counting Miller. 8 was enough to surround a house. Not enough to surround a town. The plan tightened. 2 at the front, 1 on each corner, 2 for the kitchen and garden, 3 to search with Miller. Lanterns trimmed low. No shouting, no show. The sisters would have no time to brew a fire, to carry out a sack, to pour a deadly cordial into the floor. If a man shouted, "Key," Clarissa's ring would be taken. If he shouted, "Book," Emma's ledger would be pried loose from whatever false saint's niche she had made for it. On the 14th, fog lay late. The oil in Miller's lamp went milky with age, and he scraped the wick with his thumbnail. He wrote a single line in the secret ledger. "Move at first light, if light willing." Then he closed the book, tucked it beneath the false bottom, and laced his boots with a steadiness that surprised him. He stepped into the lane. The inn's windows glowed faintly through the mist, a ship at anchor. Somewhere beyond, the mine waited with its cold breath. A dog barked once and then, as if remembering what land it lived on, fell silent. Miller drew his coat close and walked toward the blacksmith's yard where his men would meet him, each carrying, without speaking of it, the same burden, that if they were late by an hour, a minute, the mountain would eat again. The fog lay thick over Millbrook that morning, swallowing the road and muffling the clink of bridles. Miller's detachment moved in silence, the leather of their coats creaking in the cold damp. By the time they reached the Millbrook Inn, the lamps in the front windows were already lit, casting warm yellow pools on the fog, a welcome sight to any traveler, and a perfect mask for what they had come to end. Emma McAllister herself opened the door. She wore a dark wool dress and a neat cap, her face a picture of polite surprise, though Miller noted the stillness in her hands, the absence of any true alarm. Behind her, Lillian stood half hidden in the parlor's shadow, her eyes bright and calculating. Mary's skirts rustled in the hallway, and Clarissa appeared at the stairwell clutching that familiar ring of keys. "Sheriff," Emma said, as if greeting a man to breakfast. "We weren't expecting callers at this hour." "You'll forgive the intrusion," Miller answered. "We have business to attend to." The men fanned out. 2 took the kitchen, 2 the garden, 1 to each end of the hall, while Miller led 3 into the parlor. At first glance the room was impeccable, carpets beaten clean, mantel polished, the air scented faintly with dried lavender. But in the drawers of the sideboard lay small chests filled with gold rings, pocket watches, and coins from half a dozen states. In the basement they found something colder, stacked crates bearing false labels, tea, coffee, seed grain, but inside each lay personal effects. Letters tied in faded ribbon, family daguerreotypes, travel documents, all neatly packed as if for shipment. The air was heavy with the smell of earth and something sharper, the acrid tang of preserved herbs. Out in Mary's walled garden, the men discovered neat rows of belladonna, foxglove, and hemlock, their leaves still wet with night dew. "No use for cooking," one deputy muttered, glancing at Miller. He only nodded. The sisters stood together in the parlor as the evidence mounted. Emma's eyes gave nothing away. Lillian's mouth curved in a faint, mocking smile. Mary's lips trembled, but her gaze stayed fixed on the floor. Clarissa shifted from foot to foot, pale as linen, her fingers worrying the keys until Miller stepped forward and took them. But the final blow came hours later in the mountains. Guided by the Welshman's memory of an old smuggler's track, the men found a narrow, rock-walled path that opened suddenly to the yawning black of the abandoned copper mine. The entrance was half concealed by brush, a crude gate bolted with fresh iron. The lock gave under Harris's crowbar, and a wave of air rolled out, cold, stale, and fouled with the smell of death long hidden. Lanterns threw their light against damp stone. The first body lay just within the entrance, a man's skeleton still wrapped in the tattered remnants of a traveling coat. 10 paces in, another. Some were no more than scattered bones, others still bore scraps of clothing, their outlines preserved in the dust. Skulls showed the marks of blunt force. Ribs were fractured in ways no fall could explain. In several cases, a black crust at the edges of the jaw suggested the burning of strong poison. They counted them slowly, carefully, until the tally reached 43. On a ledge near the far wall, a fresher corpse lay with its face turned toward the light. Samuel Parks, the cotton trader, identified by a watch still clutched in one stiff hand. Miller stood a long time in that hollow, the lamplight guttering as the damp S** ket at the flame. Each of these people had come to Millbrook trusting in the welcome of the Millbrook Inn, and each had walked this same path to die in the dark. He imagined the sisters here at night, their skirts brushing the rock, sacks heavy in their hands, the sound of shovels scraping in the silence. When the men emerged from the mine, the fog was breaking, lifting in slow shreds to reveal the sharp ridges of the mountains. Down in the valley, the inn stood quiet, its windows unlit now, its false warmth gone. Miller gave the order to take the sisters to Nashville. He did not look back at the mine. The journey to Nashville began under a sky the color of pewter, the kind that promised an early frost. The McAllister sisters rode in a covered wagon flanked by mounted deputies, their hands bound but their backs straight. Emma sat nearest the front, her expression fixed and unreadable. Lillian kept her eyes on the passing road, lips curved faintly as if savoring some private thought. Mary clutched a small bundle of linen. No one had dared search it too closely for fear of provoking her. Clarissa sat apart, pressed into the wagon's corner, her thin fingers worrying the hem of her shawl. Along the road, word traveled faster than the procession itself. Farmers leaned on their gates to watch them pass. Children stood barefoot in the dust, staring with the blunt curiosity only the young possess. In one hamlet, an old woman crossed herself as the wagon rolled by. In another, a man spat into the ditch, muttering something about justice come too late. By the time they reached Nashville, the case had become a sensation. Broadside sheets nailed to tavern walls bore headlines like "Mass Grave in the Mountains" and "4 Sisters Accused of Heinous Crimes." Crowds gathered daily outside the courthouse, a restless mix of curiosity seekers, grieving relatives, and men hoping to sell newspaper accounts of the proceedings for a few cents apiece. The trial opened on November 3, 1851, in the packed oak-paneled chamber of the Davidson County Courthouse. Judge William Harcourt presided, his white hair giving him a look of stern, almost biblical authority. The sisters sat together at the defense table, Emma in black silk, the others in dark wool dresses. A single guard stood behind them at all times. Witness after witness took the stand. The Welsh miner described finding the mine entrance, his voice faltering when he spoke of the stench and the sight within. Deputy Harris produced the crates of personal effects, setting them one by one before the jury, a gold ring here, a child's photograph there, each object a silent accusation. Reverend Talley testified about the missing travelers who had once passed through his church, reading from letters never answered. When Dr. Matthew Price, the Nashville coroner, gave his account, the courtroom fell silent but for the scratching of the clerk's pen. He described fractured skulls, broken ribs, and the black residue of poison on bone. His conclusion was plain: the deaths were no accident, nor the work of a single night. "We are looking," he said, "at 20 years of calculated K*ling." The defense offered little beyond denial. Emma spoke once, calmly, insisting that the goods in the cellar were left by guests who never returned to claim them. Lillian gave a short, almost bored statement, suggesting that the mountains hold dangers enough without blaming us. Mary refused to speak at all. Clarissa's testimony was halting. She claimed she had done only as her elder sisters instructed and had never seen the mine until the day of their arrest. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Emma, Lillian, and Mary were found guilty on all counts and sentenced to hang. Clarissa, only 15 when the K*lings began, was spared the noose but given life in the Tennessee State Penitentiary. The executions took place at dawn on December 12, in the yard behind the courthouse. A cold wind carried the smell of coal smoke from the nearby rail yards. Townsfolk gathered early, their breaths clouding in the air, their murmurs hushed as the women were led to the gallows. Emma mounted the steps without hesitation. Lillian followed with her head high, eyes sweeping the crowd. Mary's knees trembled, but she did not stumble. None spoke a final word. When the trapdoors fell, the crowd exhaled as one. Clarissa was taken that same day to the penitentiary, a looming limestone fortress on the city's edge. She passed through its iron gates without looking back. Records show she lived another 43 years, dying in her cell in 1894, her grave marked only by a number. Back in Millbrook, the inn was boarded shut before winter. The land was eventually sold to a mining company, which reopened the copper shaft for a few unprofitable years before sealing it again. At the mine's mouth, Sheriff Miller had a stone marker placed: "Here lie unknown travelers, 1831 to 1851. May their rest be undisturbed." For a time, visitors came to see the place where the 43 had been found. But as the years passed, fewer made the climb. The path grew over, the carved letters weathered. The townsfolk rarely spoke the sisters' names aloud. Children were told only that the mine was dangerous and to keep away. Miller served another decade as sheriff before retiring to a small farm by the river. In later years, when asked about the case, he would say he believed he had uncovered only part of the truth. "The mountains," he once told a journalist, "hold places the sun hasn't touched in 100 years. We found one of them. God knows what else sleeps up there." And so Millbrook settled back into its quiet rhythms. The forge clanged, the church bell tolled, the tavern filled on Saturday nights. But on certain foggy mornings, when the wind carried a strange damp from the hills, the older folk would pause in their work and glance toward the ridge, as if remembering something better left buried.